Today is the first day in a series of episodes I'm doing to share recovery stories from families who are using approaches other than tough love, like craft or harm reduction. We hear more about the idea of all paths to recovery, meaning there's no one size fits all solution, but we don't hear stories that bring meaning to the results of those approaches very often. Most of the recoveries that are widely shared include tough love. And I think that not only families who are second guessing not using tough love, but everyone who believes that tough love is the only way needs to hear these stories. And stories are particularly powerful for igniting social change and shifting views because stories are easier to relate to than abstract concepts. So, we're kicking off the series with our guest, Pam Lanhart, today. And I've had her on the podcast a couple of times, but we've talked a lot more about the after part of her story and how she approaches substance use now. But today we're going to talk about where she started and her evolution to getting to where she is today. So Pam is the founder and executive director of Thrive Family Recovery Resources, and she is passionate about helping families use evidence-based best practices in order to help families find peace, stay regulated, and create the conditions that support recovery and move their loved ones towards change. She believes that a healthy family gives their loved ones the best opportunity to activate recovery. Pam is a certified family recovery coach, peer recovery specialist, invitation to change and craft practitioner, and a RISE trained interventionist. She also co-directed and co-produced a documentary called Together Family Recovery, which redefines what recovery can look like through the lens of family. Rather than focusing solely on the individual struggling with addiction, the film follows three courageous families who have chosen to walk the path of healing together. So, Pam, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for inviting me back, Heather. It's so great to see you and it's great to be here.
So, I want to go back to the beginning. I think, like, whenever I hear one of my mentors or somebody that I admire go back to the beginning of their story, I so appreciate it because I see who they are today and I feel like it's impossible that they were ever any different. And so when I hear that story, it helps me to be think, okay, maybe I really can do this. Maybe I can be take on more of the characteristics of that person. So, before your son Jake started struggling with substances, what did you believe about substance use and where did those beliefs come from?
Yeah, so I think it's a good idea to just go all the way back. I
Okay.
always said I was destined to do this work. I was born in it
Mhm.
because I have two parents that struggled significantly with alcohol use. And so my dad and mom married really young. My mom was 16, my dad was 18. And there's this generational historical pattern of risk taking, substance use, mental health issues in our family. So, one of the things that I do when I work as an ARISE trained interventionist or comprehensive care consultant is a genogram. And if you look at a genogram is like a family tree, but it's where you use like colored pencils to kind of color in the patterns in the family history. And if you looked at ours, it would be all full of colors. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about is that genetics, is it environment? We can talk about that later. But there's a pattern. My dad's dad ran liquor during prohibition. He was a big gambler. My dad um, lost his father when my dad was only 18 months old. So he grew up without a father. And then his stepdad walked out on them when he was 10. So there was this double abandonment that led to uh, his substance use issues, in addition to having five kids by the time he was 25 years old. And that was a big, weighty responsibility. So you look at these family patterns, and in our work as a invitation to change practitioner, it's the concept of behaviors make sense. So you look back and you go, no wonder. And honestly, he died when I was just 27, and I can't be mad at him Like I have this whole new understanding of his substance use because of the things that I've learned in the work that I get to do every day. So his behaviors made sense, my mom's behaviors made sense, and my environment was very unsafe, right? It was very traumatic growing up in the home that I grew up in, and there was a lot of fighting and drinking and fighting. And finally, they got divorced. And then when I was 17, my mom, we did an intervention. Now, I didn't know that that's what it was at the time, but I remember sitting around in a circle and we all read our letters. And, she said, okay, I'll go in, but I'll be out in 2 days because I know I don't have a problem. And she did her 30 days and that was it. She was, activated her recovery. And then, fast forward, right? So that's kind of my family history. I have two siblings that are in recovery as well that struggle with substance use. And again, I understand what's behind those things now and the trauma. And they were kind of the scapegoats in our family, especially with my dad and his abuse. So there was a, a lot of that going on. And the understanding now, again, like that was the manifestation of his trauma. Hurt people, right? Hurt people, hurt people, and he did. And then you bring that trauma into your family. So this is something that I try to really encourage families to understand. And it's not a blame thing. I don't, you can't blame anybody. And I thought I was a good parent, but now that I know more about, trauma and what's happened to you, which by the way is a great book, and you look back and you go, there is no way that you can't bring that into your family. So when I work with families, some of the first questions I ask are, did you have parents that struggle with substance use? Did you have trauma in your life? Because that really informs how we respond to our loved ones when they start to struggle. So you can imagine what that felt like when Jake started to struggle. So I married young. That's one of our patterns in our family. I actually am a great grandma because we have 5 generations now, and it's really because we all married. My mom was 16, 19, 19, 19, and had kids young. So, I married young. I found a man that was exactly the opposite of my family. We are loud, opinionated, strong, controlling, and I found this really great, steady Finn. And he's deep well, but he does not show emotion. And so but it was what I needed. It was exactly what I needed at the time. So fast forward, we've been married, like, the math, whatever, around 20 years or so. And we have Jake. We had 4 kids. So our oldest is 41, and then we have now a 30-year-old. Jake would be 29, and our youngest is 26. And when you have grown up in this environment where there's so much chaos and so much, I call it adaptive behavior. I don't like using the word maladaptive. I will not pathologize a family. We adapt to trauma. And so we have behaviors that make sense because we're protecting ourselves and we want to feel safe. So those behaviors manifest, right, in our lives, which might look like, control or manipulation or other kind of um, maybe addictive behaviors. So he's 13 or 12 when his substance use started. And I'm I mean, it I had checked all the boxes. I had really wanted to parent differently than my parents parented me. And I think I felt like, and I think a lot of parents feel like, that it's formulaic, right? If I do 1 plus 1, it's always going to equal 2. And so we did what we were told in our church community, in our, with the school system, with um, our all the things, right? And we thought that if we did these things, that we would have this outcome that we could guarantee, which we know isn't the case. So Jake, Jake's substance use started, and when he was 15, he went to his first treatment, and we heard all the narratives. And, in our documentary, we talk about modern family recovery is kind of the term we use. So for 80 years, families have been conditioned, and it is a conditioning because it's a narrative that has been propagated. Um, and it is, this is the way you do this. And so we heard these narratives, um, even from the family program or the treatment center that we went through. You know, you're an enabler. And that was probably one of the biggest things that was like, if you help your loved one, you are automatically codependent. If you give them even a dime, you're an enabler. And there wasn't any accommodation for the fact that he was only 15. These were there, it's called the Minnesota model. And a lot of treatment centers use it, which is a mix of clinical therapeutic interventions along with 12 steps. And so that was the only way, that was the only pathway. And we were told, this kind of the narrative of detachment, letting go, tough love. And so that's, I think we took it, I think probably to the extreme, or, it gave us permission. Here's the thing, that narrative, those languages give us permission to put up a wall and dehumanize another person. That's what it does. Um, when I look at somebody else as a name or label rather than as who they are, it allows me to create a power differential. And so I think that's human nature. We all do it. We all do it. And so you create this power differential because you want to protect yourself. So he's the addict, he's the alcoholic, he's the problem. Um, and we have to confront or get him out of denial, which I think is kind of part of that tough love narrative. I have to be, I think some people take that tough love as a way or an excuse to justify really unkind behavior. And we were in that camp. We were like, you know, our way or the highway. And the first 2 times that we asked Jake to leave, it was really confrontational. And we were we were, and I know a lot of people would say they've done these things because you do the best you can. But I remember pinning him down and pulling bags of marijuana out of his hands and, calling the police when he was drinking and, um, going in his room and searching everything and looking for the empty, we were looking for evidence. We were looking for the evidence to support our narratives and to be right. And I think it's natural, but it's also not healthy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I identify with everything that you just said, and I really appreciate that you took it way back in the family history because it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. I think we start with where did I go wrong as a parent? And you just really widen that lens of this didn't just suddenly happen. It's been getting set up for generations.
Yeah,
And
I just wanna add one thing that I kind of forgot in there, which was that I was in a trauma response then. So, like, his substance use took me all the way back to my childhood, and it I was in that same unsafe environment. So, I'm in a trauma response, and when we're in that trauma response, and I'm sure you've done podcasts about what happens in the brain, your amygdala is activated, you're operating on instinct. And so you just react, right? There's no moderation, there's no regulation. And that totally stirred up all this trauma. And I didn't know until probably 10 years ago, or maybe even less, that that was even a thing because we weren't talking about it back then.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't understand trauma at all. I had no idea. I only thought it was, like, people who'd been to war, like, that was the only reference point I had about any kind of trauma. And, I loved what you said about not using labels or pathologizing, because I think it takes away our choices. Like, oh, we already feel like something's wrong with us. And now we're getting diagnosed by these professionals that for sure there's a name for what's wrong with us. And so now I know that I can't trust myself anymore because I have all these conditions that they've labeled me with. How do you think that impacted you hearing those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it puts you in a victim mentality. And I think that, when we're in a trauma response or when we're in a stage of grief, it manifests in a couple different ways. We can be a rescuer, we can be a victim, we can be a persecutor. And I was all three of those things, but mostly I was in that victim mentality. Woe is me, poor me. Nobody understands what it's like. And then sometimes I would fall into that persecutor role because I felt like because people were telling me there was nothing I could do. So then I would react and, um, you know, just let loose, right?
Mhm,
Maybe if I just go wild and crazy on him, he will finally um, get it, or he will figure out that he's ruining his family's life. So this was my mentality early on was, a lot of blame, a lot of shame, a lot of shame. I mean, I'm I feel um, some shame in that, right? That I put so much shame on him because I didn't know what I didn't know, you know.
mhm,
And I share this when I speak, and I just shared it the other night. But it's that thing of like 4th grade, and he was the naughty boy, right? He was the kid that was getting in trouble at school and would get detention or suspension. And I remember in 4th grade him throwing a pencil across the room. And I got a call from school and he got detention, I think, for a week after that. And what hits me now about that is I didn't stop to ask why he threw the pencil. So we look at the external behaviors, but we don't stop to ask why, right? And so that was we wanted to mitigate external behaviors. We wanted to feel safe in our home. We wanted our kids to feel safe. And so we exhibited a lot of what I call make it stop behaviors that were very, very unhealthy.
mhm. Yeah, that I did the same thing, those make it stop behaviors. I was just doing anything I could to make it stop. I had very limited curiosity. My curiosity was good for, like, maybe a day or 2 until I didn't get the results that I was hoping for, and then the curiosity was back out the window. Um, I'm wondering, like, that idea of hearing that he had to hit rock bottom, you mentioned earlier that this conditioning that we receive about how we're supposed to approach things and how it kind of can become an excuse for some behavior that we wouldn't engage in otherwise as parents. Um, how did that idea of him needing to hit rock bottom play into that?
Yeah, for me, he went to treatment so young that there was always just this hope that he would get better.
Mhm.
So I don't know that I really lived in that space of he needs to hit rock bottom, um, because I think I changed my ideology before he was close to that, but I do hear it. I see it when I work with families, and I probably work with thousands of families, and it creates a punitive environment. I have to somehow create an environment that will help him hit rock bottom, so it's not setting a boundary, it's kicking him out to make him change. You know, um, it's very, uh, punitive and consequential rather than, just kinda stepping out of the way. One of the things that did happen when he was 16 as he went through a treatment court program. We have a juvenile treatment court program in our county, and that was the first time I saw the impact of person-centered language and our rap team and leveraging the his strengths and the strengths of the network to create this environment. And at the time I didn't even know really what they were all doing. I mean, now that I know and we do that work, I know what it is, but I think I was like, "You need to put him in JDC because he popped, positive for, uh, drug test," and I was like, I just wanted him to get punished,
Yeah.
And I think that's what that mentality does sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my thought was just like, "Let's get her there as fast as possible so we can all stop suffering."
Mhm.
And it's funny when you my daughter, when she was in the juvenile system, was the first time I heard of harm reduction, and while you were talking about that, I was thinking, I heard the words, but I didn't understand it, and then you said the same thing, like, there wasn't enough they were talking about those things, but I wasn't receiving education that would help me, but I was gleaning a few things that would play in later to help me change. So it seems like a big missed opportunity for families to really learn something different right there.
Yeah, and, I would say, Jake was probably it was after I started doing this work. So I went through our certified peer recovery training in 2016. And that was the first time I ever heard of the concept of harm reduction and even medications for not just opiate use disorder. We think about medications for OUD, but there are medications for alcohol use disorder. Now they're using some really innovative things for stimulant use. There's a lot of uh, discovery around GLP-1s and what they do for people who are struggling with addiction. But he went through his first treatment in 2013, and so I didn't really hear any of that until 3 4 years later. So um, and again, you don't know what you don't know, and of course, as we started to learn, and this is the thing, it was education and skill-based therapy that changed us. And my book, when I write it, will be called From Tough Love to Loving Well, because through that process of um, getting educated, we went to dialectical behavioral therapy. We had to do that when he was in treatment court. And then my younger daughter, started self harming, and so that was the recommended therapy for self-harm. And when you're an adolescent, your mom or dad has to go to DBT with you. And it was radically revolutionary for me. Like it was transformational because when you grow up with a parent or parents that are struggling, you never learn how to be curious. You never learn how to communicate effectively. Those things weren't a part of my DNA. And so I did not have the skills until we started doing cognitive therapy, and that idea of just equipping, right? Equipping really helped change our family. That was that, and then the education piece, which is there,
How many years were you into it before you received that education and the cognitive therapy that actually helped turn things in a better direction?
yeah. So we were really lucky. Jake started using, he would say 11 or 12, right? And he went to his first treatment at 15, um, which gave us some education about substance use. But at the time, the education was still sort of pathologizing. You know, the family is dysfunctional, there's family rules and addiction. Um, and then it was, so that was 2013. And it was 20, probably 14 when we started DBT. And that was really, again, that was a precipice. That and the drug court rap team really built the foundation for me to begin to look at addiction and recovery really differently. Yeah. And to feel empowered. When you become educated, you feel empowered. When like you said, you hear these messages, there's nothing you can do and you're powerless. And I I was so empowered and I was so excited to have some concrete framework for how to communicate differently in a way that wasn't um I always say what you mean, but don't say it mean.
Mm.
So I learned to be able to do something different, and that was revolutionary for me.
So, was it just that education, or was there, like, a turning point moment for you where you were like, "This is not working for us the way we're doing things?"
Yeah, I do share this story often, but he was 17 and he had been living with a friend because we had booted him out, and it was by the collar, get the heck out of our house. I'm sure we didn't use the word heck. Um, and he wanted to come back home. And we were my mama's heart wanted to have him come back home. And we sought counsel from a pastor who actually knew us well, knew Jake well. Um, his boys played rugby with Jake. And as we were sitting in his office, he said this. He said, "Are you going to be right for the sake of justice, or are you going to love for the sake of relationship? Because love never fails." And that was that I still have it on a piece of paper on my mirror in my bedroom. That's how impactful it was. That you know, over a decade later, because it has served me in all of my relationships, right? Um, and we were reading a book, or we had read a book called The Anatomy of Peace, which talks about this exact thing, that we can be right in our position, but we are entirely wrong if we're wrong in our way of being towards somebody. And I hadn't ever heard that phrase before I read that book. And our way of being with Jake was, we're right, you're wrong, we're good, you're bad, we're, uh, we're the ones that know what to do, and you don't, because you're, and it was just a moment of clarity for us. And I use that term instead of rock bottom when I do my work. I always talk about a moment of clarity, because that really is what happens is, and it, for most people, they do not get into recovery when you might look at them and think that they're at their rock bottom, right?
Mhm.
And it might be something as simple as a bad dream and I wake up and I know it's time. Or, I see somebody in a context of a fulfilling life and I desire to want that, right? So that was that's I think the story for a lot of people in family recovery is, I see families thriving. I see families flourishing even in the middle of um, this horrible journey. I want what they want. I want to drink that water,
Mhm.
you know? And so that was really the moment.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Um, and you had a choice to make there, like, you could have heard that and not taken it in. What do you think the cost of that would have been, of not answering the call to this different way of being?
Yeah. Well, if you haven't heard me on any of the other podcasts, you probably the end of the story is that we did lose Jake. Um, but the middle of the story is the healing. And I call it Lazarus time because we were living on borrowed time and we lived every single day like we were living on borrowed time, especially once we found out he was using opiates. We were like, he could die. And we knew that. And we wanted to heal. And we wanted to love him well. We wanted to lean into that relationship. We started giving him agency in his decisions. We started um, uh, just really stepping back from the narratives of detachment. We did everything we could, anytime we could, to connect with him, even when he wasn't living in our house. We'd pick him up and bring him to work, or we'd go have him, go help him get a haircut. And this was when he was using. And there's a lot of, in fact, I just heard it yesterday. I recorded a different podcast, and the guy was like, "Yeah, we told our brother that, you know, we wouldn't ever be around him unless he stopped using." Like, and that is not my message. That is not my heart. I think that disconnection leads them deeper into drug use, to be honest, because
I
like,
agree.
substances are predictable, reliable, dependable, right? They're consistent. They're always the same. So the substance loves unconditionally. It doesn't judge. It it makes me feel better. And then I have this family over here that's making me feel shame and there's conflict and yelling and chaos. And so you know, logically, which one would you choose? Right.
Yeah.
So I think we really became very, very intentional about how we showed up and how we connected. And just, yeah, it was different. It was the way we walked through this was was healing. And we started doing our work too, right? It wasn't just him going to treatment and getting into recovery. It was us doing the things that I think were, parallel to his treatment and recovery. We went to therapy. Um, I couldn't find a support group that fit, so I created them. you know,
That's right.
and so I built a community and I built that support. And then we did things you know, like when you look at Sams's definition of the four pillars of recovery, home health, community, purpose, we created community. We found our sense of purpose. We built in routines. Recovery is a lot about routine, and we created routines in our life that helped us to um stay regulated. We learned how to self regulate when we were activated or our central nervous system was, so you learn some somatic practices of How do I get myself back to a place where I'm in my prefrontal cortex and can make reasonable and logical decisions? So I think from that moment, we just became very intentional about all the things that we did with him. And that's a
Yeah.
good.
Oh, sorry. I didn't get that, like, until after Helena passed away, then it was the real the whole thing up until that point had been, well, I had made the decision to make the most of my what was available to me because I didn't know if I'd ever see her in recovery. And then it became like, "Oh, I'm getting the happy ending, we're gonna get the happily ever after." And then afterwards, I realized, like, I don't have to live with I have peace knowing that I answered that call to change when I had the information in front of me, and that is something that nothing, no situation can ever take away from me.
I mean, I might have shared this on one of the other podcasts, but I remember about that same time these 3 questions. One was, if and when Jake got well, would he wanna have a relationship with me? Right? And that was really important to me. Or would I be the one that the treatment centers would say, "Ooh, like, she's not a safe person." I wanted to be a safe person for him. And then the second thing was because I am a person of faith, it was, and would he want to have, uh, would he see us as living in our faith, living in our values? Or would he view us as, you know, malaligned or hypocritical? That was really important to me to show up in my values. And then the third question was, and if God forbid the worst thing happened, when I look back at that last text or that last message or that last moment, would I have any regrets?
Mhm.
And the truth is all of those things, really happened. Like he did lean into relationship with us and we did heal together. And he did walk in a spirit in spiritual practices. And of course, I have those last texts and I don't live with regret. And, if you are listening and you might be in a position where you have lost a child, there is no shame in anything you did. I hope that you know that you really did do the best that you could at the time. And, I think that there's freedom in that. There's freedom in knowing that, you know. But I feel very confident that um, we showed up and he knew he was loved and he loved us. In fact, um, he had a little relapse. Well, it wasn't a little relapse. His relapses got shorter but more intense. And so he had relapsed April before he died and he was on his way to a treatment program. And he had the presence of mind to send me flowers for Mother's Day. And I just looked at my phone this morning and it was, "Mom, thank you for all your love, for all your support." Um, you know, I can't remember exactly, but to get that, right, from your son. And um, yeah, those are the things that are so precious looking back.
Yeah. I was about to ask that, like, what he noticed in the changes in you. But I don't before we run out of time, what's something that you would like people to remember about Jake? Like, that a lot of people what we're sharing is just one dimension of him right now. So, what would you like people to know about him besides that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we when you separate the behaviors of addiction with the person that is um who they are. Jake was a fantastic kid and everywhere he went he had favor. Everybody loved him. He was super charismatic. He was adventurous. He never got off the phone without saying, "I love you." Um, and as a and he had a very long-term relationship with his girlfriend Maddie, who we are still really close to. And people just loved that kid. And I think, we have to, one of the things that I really want to get across is that when you stop seeing your person as a AKA addict, um, and you start seeing them as a human being, you can start to see the good, right? I think we have to look for it, and it's hard sometimes, but the good is there. It's there. And um, yeah, you know, I think him and Elena, they would have been friends,
Yeah.
right? They probably would have been friends. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, one of the things that you created was community. So can you share a little bit about what you offer now because of that?
Yeah. So we are actually a 501c3. We have staff. I think sometimes people come into our Facebook group and they don't really understand that we're like a real organization. Um, but everything we do is informed by the invitation to change, craft, loving well approach. So when we first started, it was a decade ago, and I was on Facebook, and I was like, I'm starting this little group in Burnsville, Minnesota. Anybody want to come? And we had 6 people show up. Now we have, I don't know, 23 groups that meet every week that we manage. Some of them are virtual. We have 9 groups that meet online, and they all are different, because they have different leaders, but we all use this approach of harm reduction, loving well. And then we have a very large Facebook group, which has, 9,700 people in that community from all over the world. And it is a great place to learn about the craft approach and learn, you know, practically how are people using it. And then we also have a navigator on our staff. So we do a lot of helping families find resources, helping them navigate the systems of care, because that can be a full-time job. And so we will take we have a form, and it doesn't matter where you live. We get enough information to be able to help you find, some options for treatment. And because when they do want it, you have a window, and you need to be ready for that. And then, we also do educational workshops, and probably 3 times a year, I do, um, a a craft workshop, I do a boundary workshop, so they're open to anybody anytime. And then, of course, now we have this documentary that we're screening in certain cities right now. It's not available broadly for, you know, anybody to watch yet. It will be. Um, but that has a beautiful 12-week discussion guide, so people can take the documentary, screen it, and then do a 12-week program if they want to. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the services you offer, I send so many people to you. I think one day you're gonna text me and say, "Heather, stop sending people over this way."
Actually, it's funny because I do like, "Oh, I've been working with Heather," or, "Yeah, I've been listening to Heather." One other thing I wanted to mention is here in Minnesota, we actually do, one-on-one, we call it family peer recovery services. So, and we do have a mentor program. So for people, okay, everybody, if you have financial resources, coach with Heather. And I do private coaching too, but I'm gonna give you a shout out today, Heather. But if you don't have those financial resources, we do have trained mentors that work nationally, virtually. So people that come into our community and start to engage can get hooked up with a mentor. We try to match them based on circumstances, and then they get some of that one-on-one help as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think that we can't possibly have enough services in this area and enough information getting put out there about craft and invitation to change and things like that. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and you taking the time out of your schedule today to be here to do this podcast episode.
It is always, I mean, I'm never gonna say no, Heather, so 'cause, I adore you.
Yeah.